At 11:32 on the morning of November 29th, 1943, Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran knelt in the tail section of a B-17 flying fortress named Ricky Tikatabi, watching. German fighters swarmed toward his bomber like angry hornets. 19 years old, a farm boy from Wisconsin, his first combat mission over a heavily defended target. The 8th Air Force had sent over 300 bombers to destroy Bremen's factories that morning. German defenders had already shot down 6 flying fortresses in the first hour. Moran's position was the loneliest on the aircraft. The tail gunner sat on a bicycle-style seat at the very back of the bomber, separated from the rest of the crew by 40 feet of fuselage. His only company was a pair of .50 caliber machine guns, and the German fighters trying to kill him. The B-7 carried 10 men, pilot and co-pilot in the cockpit, navigator and bombardier in the nose, flight engineer in the top turret, radio, operator behind the bomb bay, 2 waist gunners standing at open windows, ball turret gunner hanging beneath the aircraft in a glass sphere, and Moran alone in the tail. The tail gunner's job was simple: protect the bomber's most vulnerable angle. German pilots had learned early in the war that attacking from directly behind a B-7 put them in the firing arc of only one man, the tail gunner. By November 1943, the 8th Air Force was losing bombers at a catastrophic rate. The mission to Schweinfurt 2 months earlier had cost 60 flying fortresses in a single day, 600 men killed or captured in one afternoon. Bomber crews called deep missions into Germany milk runs to hell. The mathematics of survival were brutal. A bomber crew had to complete 25 missions to go home. Statistical analysis showed the average crew lasted 15 missions. Some groups were losing half their aircraft every month. Moran had enlisted the day he turned 18. Growing up on a dairy farm near Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin, he had watched aircraft pass overhead and dreamed of flying. The Army Air Forces needed gunners, young men with quick reflexes and steady nerves, farm boys who knew how to shoot. Gunnery training taught him to track fast-moving targets while compensating for wind, altitude, and the speed of his own aircraft. He learned to fire in short bursts to prevent his barrels from overheating. He memorized the silhouettes of German fighters: Messerschmitt Bf 109, Fallwolf 190. He could identify them at 2,000 yards. But training could not prepare anyone for the reality of combat over Germany. The cold at 24,000 feet dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. The thin air made every movement exhausting, and the German fighters came in waves, firing 20mm cannons that could tear through aluminum like paper. Ricky Tikatabi had taken off from Snetton Heath in England that morning as part of the 96 Bomb Group. The target was Bremen, an industrial city on the West River. Shipyards, aircraft factories, submarine pens, one of the most heavily defended cities in Germany. The bomber formations had crossed the North Sea in tight defensive boxes, each B-7 positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. The theory was simple: pack the bombers close together so their combined firepower could drive off enemy fighters. The reality was that a direct hit on one aircraft often damaged those flying beside it. Bremen's anti-aircraft defenses opened fire as the formations approached. Black bursts of flak filled the sky. The bombers could not maneuver. They had to fly straight and level for the bomb run. Shrapnel tore through wings and fuselages. Moran watched a B-7 in the formation ahead take a direct hit. It folded in half and dropped from the sky. Ricky Tikatabi released its bombs over the target. For 1,000 pounds of high explosives tumbling toward the factories below, mission accomplished. Now they just had to survive the flight home. If you want to see how Moran's mission turned out, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Moran, the bomber. Formation began its turn toward England, 200 m of hostile airspace between them, and safety. That was when Ricky Tikatabi's No. 2 engine took a direct hit from flak. The propeller Windmilled uselessly. The aircraft began losing speed. A damaged bomber falling. Behind the formation was a death sentence. German fighter pilots watched for stragglers. A lone B-7 without the protection of mass defensive fire was easy prey. Moran saw them coming. A dozen Messids climbing from below. Another group of flock wolves diving from above. Ricky Tikatavi was about to fight, alone against overwhelming odds. And in the tail gunner position, Eugene Moran would be their first target. The first Mises came in from the 6 o'clock, low positioned directly behind and beneath the bomber. Moran pressed his shoulders against the steel chest plate behind him and squeezed the triggers. His twin .50 calibers roared to life. Tracer rounds. Strang fighter. The German pilot broke off his attack and rolled away. But there were many more. The wolves attacked in pairs. One would draw the gunner's attention while the other lined up a killing shot. Moran swung his guns from target to target. Spent brass. Casings piled up around his knees. The smell of cordite filled the cramped compartment. At 24,000 feet, the temperature inside Ricky Tikatavi was 43 degrees below zero. Moran wore an electrically heated flight suit, but the cold still seeped through. His breath formed ice crystals on his oxygen mask. The machine guns grew hot from continuous firing, while his fingers went numb inside his gloves. The German pilots were professionals, Luftwaffe veterans who had been fighting since 1939. They knew exactly how to kill a B-7. Target the engines first. A bomber with damaged engines could not keep up with his formation. Then work on the gunners. Eliminate the defensive fire. Finally, pour cannon rounds into the fuselage until something vital broke. Moran heard the impacts before he felt them. 20 millimeters. Cannon shells punching through aluminum. The sound of tearing metal. Somewhere forward, one of the waist gunners stopped firing, then the other. The intercom filled with static and fragments of voices. Moran could not tell who was speaking or what they were saying. The bomber shuddered as more rounds struck home. He kept firing. There was nothing else he could do. A wolf came in from the 4 o'clock position. Moran swung his guns and pressed the triggers. The fighter's wing disintegrated. It spiraled downward, trailing black smoke. His first confirmed kill. He did not have time to celebrate. Cannon rounds ripped through the tail section. Moran felt something slam into his left forearm, then his right. Both arms had been hit. Blood soaked through his flight suit sleeves. The pain was immediate and intense, but his hands still worked. He could still grip the triggers. More impacts. The vertical stabilizer above him took multiple hits. Control cable snapped and whipped through the air. The tail section began vibrating violently. Something was very wrong with the aircraft. Moran glanced down at his parachute. Every airman wore one. The silk canopy packed into a canvas container strapped to his chest. If the bomber went down, the parachute was his only chance of survival. He saw holes in the fabric. Multiple holes. Cannon rounds had shredded it. His parachute was useless. If he had to bail out, he would fall 4 miles to his death. The attack continued. German fighters made pass after pass. Moran counted at least 15 of them circling the crippled bomber. Ricky Tikatavi was bleeding altitude and speed. The remaining engines strained to keep the aircraft airborne. Forward in. The nose section, navigator Jesse Orson was still alive. He had been wounded but remained conscious. The pilot and co-pilot were both dead at the controls. The flight engineer was dead in his turret. The radio operator was dead. The ball turret gunner was dead. The waist gunners were dead. Of the 10 men who had taken off from England that morning, only 2 were still breathing. Orson in the nose, Moran in the tail. 40 feet of shattered fuselage between them. Another cannon round struck the bomber. This one hit something critical. Moran felt the aircraft lurch. A grinding sound echoed through the airframe. The vibration intensified until his teeth rattled. Then came a sound he would never forget. The shriek of tearing aluminum. The scream of Structural failure. Ricky Tikavy was breaking apart. The fuselage split just forward of the tail section. Moran watched the front of the aircraft separate and fall away. The wings, the engine, the cockpit, the bodies of his crewmates, all of it tumbling toward the German countryside 4 miles below. He was alone now, trapped in a severed tail section, wounded in both arms, his parachute destroyed, 24,000 feet above. Enemy territory, falling. The laws of physics offered no mercy. Terminal velocity for a human body is approximately 120 miles per hour. The tail section of AB-7 weighed several thousand pounds. It would fall faster, much faster. Eugene Moran had perhaps 90 seconds to live. The severed tail section tumbled through the sky. It spun end over end, throwing Moran against the walls of his compartment. His wounded arm screamed in agony. Pain tore through his body as warm blood sprayed violently across the shattered interior of the tail section. The wind roared like a living creature, screaming through the torn metal where the rest of the aircraft had once existed. The bomber was gone. All that remained was this broken coffin, spinning wildly in the sky. Moran should have been frozen in terror. He should have curled into himself, shut his eyes, and waited for the inevitable. Any sane man would have surrendered to fear. But Eugene Moran did something no one could explain. He kept fighting. Below him, for miles of empty air waited. Above him, German fighters circled like predators. They had seen the aircraft tear itself apart. They had watched the tail section shear away and begin its violent fall. Now they moved closer, tightening their formation. Perhaps they wanted confirmation of the kill. Perhaps curiosity pulled them in. Whatever the reason, it would cost them. They flew too close to a wounded tail gunner who had already decided he was not going to die quietly. Moran dragged his shattered arms back to the twin machine guns. The tail section spun violently, making any attempt at aim almost impossible. G-forces slammed him into a seat, then hurled him upward toward the ceiling. His arms were bleeding freely. His parachute was gone, destroyed in the explosion. He was falling 4 miles towards certain death, and he was still firing. Tracer rounds carved wild arcs through the sky as the tail section rotated. The German pilots scattered in disbelief. They had never seen anything like it. A man trapped inside a falling wreck, firing back with everything he had left. One Messerschmitt took hits across its fuselage. The pilot broke formation and dove toward the ground, trailing a stream of black smoke. The others veered away, shaken, confused, unwilling to challenge something that should not have been alive. Inside the wreckage, the altimeter was shattered, its needle frozen uselessly in place. But Moran didn't need instruments to know what was happening. He could see it, through gaps in the twisted metal. The ground grew larger. Fields, forests, roads, a patchwork of German farmland, rushing upward to meet him. The aerodynamics of the tail section were doing something impossible. The vertical stabilizer and horizontal fins acted like crude wings, biting into the air, creating drag. Instead of plunging straight down, the wreckage began to glide. The violent spinning slowed. The descent became almost controlled. Almost. Moran estimated he was falling at roughly 100 feet per second. Still fast enough to kill him on impact, but slower than a human body in free fall. Those twisted stabilizers were buying him time. Seconds, maybe a minute. Time he used to keep firing at any German fighter reckless enough to approach. The ground dropped from 5,000 feet to 3,000 to 1,000. Moran pressed himself against the steel chestplate. He wrapped his shattered arms around the ammunition boxes. There was nothing else to hold. The tail section struck the top of a pine tree at nearly 100 miles per hour. Branches as thick as a man's arm snapped like matchsticks. The vertical stabilizer caught on a trunk and tore away violently. The wreckage cartwheeled to the forest canopy, shedding aluminum with every impact. Moran's head slammed into the steel framework above him. White light exploded across his vision. He felt his ribs crack. Both arms bent at angles the human body was never meant to endure. The tail section struck another tree, spun sideways, and slammed into the frozen ground. And then, silence. Eugene Moran was alive, barely, trapped inside twisted wreckage, unable to move, surrounded by silence, pain, blood, broken metal, and the freezing German forest. He lay motionless in the shattered tail section, both forearms broken, bones protruding through skin, ribs fractured, every breast stabbing like knives inside his chest. Blood streamed from his head where fractured skull exposed brain tissue to icy air, his vision blurring, consciousness fading in and out like a dying signal. The crash site lay deep inside enemy territory, near a German town south of Bremen, surrounded by civilians who had watched American bombs destroy homes. Moran tried to move again, legs responding weakly, arms useless, body trembling as cold crept deeper, hypothermia threatening to finish what gravity failed. If wounds did not kill him, the freezing temperature would, stealing heat from his blood minute by minute as he lay helpless among broken trees. With immense effort, Moran dragged himself toward an opening in the wreckage, every movement sending waves of agony through shattered bones and torn flesh. He pulled himself onto frozen ground, staring upward at gray German sky, realizing he survived a 4-mile fall without parachute against impossible odds. Only 3 men in the entire war would ever survive such a fall, but survival meant nothing if he bled out alone. Voices echoed through trees, harsh German words, soldiers approaching cautiously to investigate crash site, rifles ready, unsure what they would find. They emerged from forests with weapons raised, surrounding wreckage, staring silently at the American airmen lying broken in the snow. One soldier shouted orders. Another ran toward road to summon an officer, while Moran lay helpless, barely breathing, unable to resist. They searched him roughly, ignoring screams as shattered arms were handled, finding dog tags, rank insignia, ruined parachute, proof he was enemy. They left him on frozen ground while examining wreckage, discussing the impossible survival with disbelief and grim curiosity. An officer arrived within the hour, studied Moran's wounds, and shook his head, convinced the American was already dying. Transport seemed pointless, but orders demanded captured airmen be interrogated, not executed, no matter how broken they appeared. They loaded Moran onto a wooden cart without stretcher, blanket, or medical care, and began the agonizing journey along frozen roads. Every jolt sent fresh pain through shattered ribs and arms, while frozen blood crusted overhead wound like dark armor. His consciousness drifted as cart rolled endlessly, time losing meaning, pain becoming constant, relentless companion. The cart delivered him to a German military facility, its purpose unclear as Moran slipped between awareness and darkness repeatedly. He remembered being carried inside, dropped onto concrete floor, German voices discussing him as if he were already dead. No doctor came, no medic, no water, no bandages, no morphine, nothing to ease suffering of a dying enemy airman. Medical supplies were scarce, reserved for Germans, not wasted on prisoners expected to die regardless. Moran lay on cold concrete for 2 days, wounds festering, infection spreading, exposed brain swelling, arms turning dark with gangrene. Without surgery, he would lose limbs. Without antibiotics, infection would reach blood, leaving him perhaps 48 hours to live. German guards watched Moran deteriorate slowly, some indifferent, others quietly sympathetic, but none possessing authority or resources to intervene or alter his fate. American bombers had devastated German cities for months, leaving hospitals overwhelmed, supplies scarce, and enemy airmen ranked lowest on survival priority lists. On the 3rd day, Moran was loaded onto another wooden cart, beginning another agonizing journey over frozen roads toward an unknown destination. Pain blurred his vision as every movement reignited agony, his body weakening, his grip on consciousness slipping further with each mile traveled. This time, the cart delivered him to a prisoner of war hospital, a converted building holding wounded Allied airmen deemed salvageable by German standards. The hospital was understaffed, undersupplied, overwhelmed, doctors forced to perform brutal triage under impossible conditions every single day. Those with survivable wounds received care, while others, judged beyond saving, were left quietly to die without intervention. Moran's injuries placed him firmly among the dying, but the hospital held an unexpected secret few Germans acknowledged openly. Among the prisoners were 2 Serbian doctors, captured military physicians from Eastern Front battles, now forced to treat wounded POWs. They worked with inadequate tools, limited anesthesia, and relentless pressure, allowed only because they freed German doctors for preferred patients. The Serbian doctors examined Moran carefully, exchanging silent glances, recognizing survival as unlikely yet refusing to abandon him, not because of orders, not because of reward, but because he was a wounded man and they were physicians. They decided to attempt surgery, fully aware failure was likely and success would require everything they possessed. The operation lasted 7 brutal hours, performed with field instruments never meant for such catastrophic injuries. No proper anesthesia dulled the pain. Only local numbing agents that barely touched the agony consuming Moran's body. He drifted in and out of consciousness as bones were reset using metal pins and crude wire. Infected tissue was cut away, pus drained, death scraped back millimeter by millimeter through sheer determination. Fragments of skull bone were removed, exposed brain covered with salvaged tissue and hope alone. A crude metal plate was secured to Moran's head, unaffected by modern standards, sufficient only to preserve life. His arms were splintered with wooden boards, bandaged using torn sheets. Every resource stretched beyond its limit. When surgery ended, the doctor spoke honestly, telling Moran the next 72 hours would decide everything. Infection might overwhelm him. Swelling could crush his brain. Bones might fail to heal despite intervention. There was nothing more medicine could offer. Survival now depended entirely on Moran's will to live. That night, fever consumed him, temperature climbing dangerously as chills racked his battered, exhausted body. The Serbian doctors remained close, changing bandages, forcing water, waiting helplessly against an invisible enemy. The fever worsened to the second night, Moran slipping into delirium, screaming warnings to dead crewmates, reliving the bomber tearing itself apart repeatedly. He called for his mother, cursed the sky, begged invisible figures, while other wounded prisoners listened, wondering whether morning would find him alive. The Serbian doctors took turns sitting beside him, offering nothing but presents, cold cloths, whispered encouragement in English he could barely hear. Antibiotics existed somewhere, but none were available here. Infection raging unchecked inside Moran's bloodstream, like an invading army. By the 3rd morning, the fever finally broke, leaving Moran weak, drenched in sweat, but alive against every expectation. The doctors examined his wounds and saw healing begin. Tissue closing around skull plate, bone starting painfully slow repair. Recovery would take months or years, damage permanent. But Eugene Moran had survived yet another impossible threshold. Word spread quickly through hospital corridors. Whispers about the American who fell 4 miles without a parachute. German guards came quietly to stare. Prisoners asked for his story, disbelief following him wherever he was wheeled. 6 weeks later, Moran could walk again, arms splinted, ribs aching, head throbbing constantly beneath metal plate. German bureaucracy resumed efficiently, photographing him, recording name, rank, serial number, reducing survival to paperwork. His destination became Stalag Luft 4, a camp designed specifically for captured Allied airmen. Barbed wire fences, guard towers, machine guns, wooden barracks barely shielding prisoners from brutal Eastern European winters. Thousands of American and British airmen filled the camp, all waiting for war's end or death. Prisoners built fragile communities, libraries from scraps, classes from memory, secret radios listening for hope. Food was scarce. Thin soup, black bread, occasional vegetables. Red Cross packages unpredictable and insufficient. Moran's body healed slowly, arms regaining function, headaches easing slightly, nightmares never stopping. 17 months of captivity stretched ahead, suffering far from finished. In summer 1944, Germans transferred Moran again, packing 60 prisoners into cattle cars. 3 days without food, sanitation, or space. Men collapsed, prayed, and endured transport through occupied Poland. Camps blurred together as Germany's empire shrank. Each transfer bringing new guards, diseases, and cruelty. The worst arrived in autumn 1944 aboard a ship later called the Hell Ship. Hundreds of prisoners were forced below deck into darkness, no ventilation, no sanitation, no room to move. The hatch closed, sealing men into metal suffocation. Nightmare beginning immediately. For days passed in darkness, bodies dying, madness spreading, filth soaking everything, hope dissolving completely.